Hello Religion 1003 students. This video, which begins our second half of the semester, will focus on denominations. This material at some level is in chapter 11 of your book of faith called Christianity, but I'll be adding a good bit of material, so it'll go way beyond what the textbook itself says. Denominations are how Christians organize themselves into groups. And while later on in the course and in the seated class time we'll be talking about the particulars of any group, or I like to call them tribes, within Christianity, during this initial part of this video lecture, I want to talk about the commonalities, the similarities between them all. And there are so many more similarities than there are differences. And I'd like us to focus on three commonalities, and they all start with the letter C, so they'll be easy to remember come test time. The first is that all groups that call themselves Christian share a common creed. Common creed, C-R-E-E-D. A creed is a word that comes from the idea of a measuring rod. It's how do you measure what you believe? And the common creed is really quite simple. Christians believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That was the early creed of the early church, to say that Jesus is Lord. And so if someone asks me, is this group Christian, that's the primary thing I want to know. What do they believe about Jesus Christ? And if they believe that he is divine, he is the Son of God, some of those particulars, I say, well, yes, they appear to be a Christian group. So that's a common creed, that they share that statement, that theological belief. That's a belief would be another word, a synonym for creed. Then you have a common cause, C-A-U-S-E. A common cause is that they're getting the message out to share about Christianity, that Christ has died and has been raised from the dead and wants to give forgiveness and new life to everyone so they can become part of the forever family. Christianity has been misunderstood as something you come and see, like you go to church and see it. Come and see, when in fact Christianity is go and tell. Go and tell. And you've probably heard of people who are missionaries, and in truth all Christians are meant to be missionaries, that is, to share their belief, their faith. Think of there as being roughly 7+ billion people on this planet, and about 2.4 billion of them are Christians. That's a lot of people. And if you live in a Western civilization, you're in, say, Western Europe, if you're in North America, for example, you would probably think that Christianity is waning, that it's losing its influence, when in fact all around the world it's gaining great numbers of members. In fact, let's a little bit of history here. In the year 1900, just 120 years ago, only 1 out of every 27 persons in the world was a Christian. 1 out of 27. And what's been called the modern missionary movement, mostly sent from the mission-sending nations, primarily in Western Europe and North America, sent persons all around the world to share this gospel message, which means good news. And by 100 years had passed, by 2000, the turn of the millennium, 1 out of every 3 persons in the world was now a Christian. So Christianity has grown dramatically, and it still continues to do. On the average, about 83,000 persons become Christians every day. Roughly about 16,000 are in North America, so that's still, and in Western Europe, so that's still a lot of people, but not anything compared to the growth of the church in Africa, or say the church in India, or the church in China or South America. That's where the real growth is. It's interesting that the very missionary sending nations in Western Europe and North America are the ones where the growth is the slowest now. And so that gives us an idea of the common creed and the common cause. And then there is a common celebration. There's a common celebration. And that's what Christians do on Sundays. They go and they worship in their own way. Some worship on Saturday. And how they do it's up to them. That's why we have this requirement in your class and in all Christian beliefs classes, that you go visit and just see how churches worship, because they're varied and they're very different. A number of years ago, I spoke at the largest Christian music festival in the country, and it was right here in Kentucky, and it was called Ichthus. They don't have it anymore. It was in Wilmore, just south of Lexington, and they would alternate having speakers, and then they would have rock groups, Christian rock groups, and I, did my part, and I spoke to, a lot of people. I think that actually about, I don't know, somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 to 20,000 people would come, mostly teenagers. And there was a group that followed right after me, and they were a punk rock group from California. And they definitely looked different. They would catch your attention. The lead singer had a green mohawk. The drummer had multicolored hair also, and it went like a sheepdog over his eye. One of the guitarists had earrings with 3 crosses hanging from each, like on Calvary. They had lots of tattoos, piercings. It looked like they'd fallen into a tackle box or something. But they would sing their music, and it was loud. It was not my musical style, and so I wasn't too into the music. But then in the breaks between the songs, one by one, each of these musicians would go up to the microphone, and they would talk about their faith in Christ, and how, because of the way they looked and their style of music, they were building a bridge to people who would never listen to a square like me. But they were reaching people with that genre of music to tell them the good news that Christ is alive and that they can have a wonderful, abundant life if they would turn to God through Christ. And I realized they're part of the family here. They have the same creed, they've got the same cause, they have their own kind of celebration, and they're Christian. This is what Christians do. They find their own unique ways to share the message. Now that we've said that, the beautiful things about Christianity, I do want to note that even to this day, there are some differences that we want to highlight. And these differences were especially true back 100 years ago, as we're entering into the 1920s, 1930s. And I'd like you to know about 2 groups which at some level exist today with some differing names. You have groups called fundamentalists, and some fundamentalists are called evangelical. And then you have persons who are liberals, often called progressives today. So back 100 years ago, it would be called fundamentalists versus liberals. Today, people would be more likely to refer to evangelicals versus progressives. And someone had written a tract, a guy named R.A. Torrey, that identified what he called 5 fundamentals of the faith. He wrote this about 100 years ago, and the name stuck. That's how the name fundamentalist came up. He was saying, here's fundamentals of Christianity that you can't change. But of course, some people bought into that. The majority did, but some disagreed. And if you would like to understand what is Orthodox Christianity at its core, Torrey was saying these were the 5 fundamentals. And I'd like you to know these because people still argue about them. The first is the Bible, or Scripture. And people argue about, is it true? Is it meant to be interpreted literally? Is it meant to be interpreted in a liberal fashion? Is there progressive new light? And that's a big one. People argue about the supremacy and the place of the Bible and how it should be honored and be revered. A second has to do with the deity of Christ. Is he who he said he is? Is he the Son of God, a deity? Is he God himself? And then third would be a big word, but we've actually studied the second part of this phrase, substitutionary atonement. Substitutionary, like the word substitute, substitutionary atonement. We've already studied atonement in class, read about it in the book, and what that means about Christ shedding his blood. And it is, what do people believe that this act of Christ on the cross actually did? Number 4, even to this day, people argue about the resurrection. The vast majority of Christians believe Christ literally was raised from the dead and still lives. And then the last of the fundamentals was the second coming, that Christ will come again. We just got done in our class talking about eschatology and about heaven and hell and things of those natures. And there is a belief that Christ will return and will redeem the earth and come for those to whom he will forever live with in heaven. The last thing we'll talk about for several minutes that I'd like you to know is that there are three streams within Christianity, three big groups. Now here are the three groups. Now these are not denominations. Here we're separating everybody in Christianity into three groups. There are Catholics. The word Catholic means universal. There are Orthodox. You could look that up in your book, the name Orthodox, Orthodox. And then there are Protestants. Protest. See that word, protest. Protestants. Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestants. Historically, for about the first 12 centuries of Christianity, 11, 12 centuries, there was only one church, and it was called the Holy Catholic Church, the Universal Church. You didn't have to ask people what church you went to. There was only one, wherever it was. But after many years, and we'll be studying this in church history, a new branch of Christianity came about, predominantly geographical, in areas such as Turkey, as in Russia, as in the Balkans. And this group split off, and they call themselves Orthodox, and they still exist today. Now, Catholics are a huge group. That's about 40% of all the Christians in the world. The Orthodox are huge too. They're probably representing another 12 to 15% of Christians. Well, huge. But everyone else is considered Protestant. So if a person is not Catholic, is not Orthodox, then they're considered Protestants. And that means everybody else, Baptist, Methodist, Nazarene, the Christian Church, fit up Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Lutherans, fit all the other groups. They're protesters. And that started literally just about 500 years ago, 1517, with a guy named Martin Luther. And Martin Luther protested against the abuses of the Catholic Church, and new groups began to form. Again, we'll talk about that more in church history. Then just in our last couple minutes, this is all I'd like you to know about Orthodox. We said that you can primarily find the Orthodox in people groups that come from the Balkans, from Russia, from Upper Middle East. You can recognize an Orthodox worship service by, of course, their ethnicity, from people who come from those parts of the world, but also by something called icons, I-C-O-N-S. An icon is either like paintings or statues, and Orthodox churches have lots of visual representations of the faith of Christ. This goes back to even the Dark Ages when people couldn't read at all and so didn't have access to the Bible, but they could go to church and they could actually see their faith. That's the Orthodox. They look a lot like Catholics. The ministers wear clerical collars. The services are very, very similar, but their priests can be real fathers. Their priests can marry. One of my best friends from seminary became an Orthodox priest. He grew a big beard, and he serves a group of Orthodox persons at a lovely church up in Ohio, and has 5 children himself. They're called father. They're priests, look like Catholic priests, but they are allowed to marry. And lastly, the Orthodox Church has, I guess, what you'd call a little more accommodating view towards marriage and divorce, where in the Catholic Church it make it very hard for you to marry and divorce. In Orthodoxy, they do, but they allow up to 2 marriages and divorces. If after your 3rd marriage you haven't figured it out, they don't allow yet another divorce, but they will allow you to have been divorced up to twice. And so more of an accommodating view for the human condition. So that's the Orthodox people. There's our 3 groupings: Catholic, Orthodox, Protestants. In class we'll be talking about the big group of the Catholics, and then we'll spend a lot of time talking about the largest groups of Protestants. Well, thank you, and I will see you in class.